Hello. Now I'd like to talk to you in part 3 of our coverage of chapter 5 in biosocial development in the first 2 years of life about the development of your sensory and motor systems, which is a really important part of infant development. In fact, your sensory perceptive system and your ability to control your motor movements are very dynamic in their development. They influence each other. So your ability to perceive what's going on in your environment, to sense it in your body, and then to coordinate movements in response to that sensation, it's a really important part of the growth of an infant. So if you've spent time watching an infant, you've noticed a lot of clumsy, not very well regulated movements of the hands, feet, and body. You'll see a lot of flexibility where the baby often can grab her feet and even bring her toes to her mouth, and she's experiencing the sensations of touch, of smell, of hearing, of vision, and really needs to learn through time and experience how to integrate that perceptive information, but also how to translate it into action. So for example, when we sense pain, we often respond to it motorically. So if you accidentally touched a hot surface, your motor system kicks in and can remove your hand from that hot surface. That happens so quickly that you're not even probably realizing that your brain had to do these complicated calisthenics to get that perceptual information from your finger to your brain to get coordinated in the cerebellum to then remove your hand. That's the sort of thing that infants are spending their time learning about. So your ability to regulate your sensory input and to respond with fluid and adaptive motor skills becomes really important for your social interaction with others, for seeking comfort, and for learning. As we will discuss, even things like emotional expressions require motor planning. And early on, if an infant has a difficult time regulating their emotional and body responses to sensations, it can be just more challenging to help that baby regulate or soothe. So there are very specific motor and sensory milestones that happen across the first 2 years of life. We often think about things like walking as key. Well, that sort of emerges at around 12 months for most, sometimes a little bit earlier, sometimes a little bit later, but there's actually a whole lot of really important foundational motor skills that have to develop before that kind of larger gross motor skill can even become possible. So let's dig into what some of those are. So the most important experiences early on are perceived with interacting senses in multiple systems, which we refer to as dynamic systems. And what that means is that they are constantly changing and constantly adjusting to what's going on in your environment. So the sensations that you have when you are held, of feeling secure, if you can feel those sensations in a healthy way, that's more likely to facilitate your ability to bond to a caregiver and respond to their efforts to comfort you. Early on in the first few months of life, infants are struggling to take in visual, hearing, taste, sense, touch, and sometimes it's very, very difficult to attend to more than one sense at a time. But it's thought that by about 6 months, infants begin to be able to coordinate the senses. In other words, hear and see at the same time. Your sensory development typically has to develop before higher order thinking can occur. So we have to help the central nervous system and the motor system sync up in healthy ways before later more complex aspects of development can kick in. So one of the things that nurses in a neonatal intensive care unit would do, for example, is make sure that the premature baby is getting the kind of sensory input that a healthy human baby would get while they were still in utero. So one of the conventions that we'll see is the use of a lot of touch and massage therapy and skin-to-skin contact between usually parents or family members and a premature baby. And the idea there is that we need to supplement the sensory input that a baby would feel in the womb of being enveloped in the uterus in the womb. Instead, we have the baby outside in the world, and so we want to try to mimic that so that the baby's sensory system can grow in expected ways. There's a lot of research that suggests, for example, that infant massage and touch therapy is very important for stimulating healthy brain development in infants. And there are several different professions that are focused on healthy development of the sensory system. One of those would be nursing. Another would be occupational therapists. They often work in the area of sensory motor development and not only help infants regulate those things, but help individuals with developmental disorders whose sensory and motor systems are not well integrated, and occupational therapists can help individuals to adapt better even at older ages. So let's take a moment to differentiate between two really important terms, and I hope I haven't misused them up to this point. These are the formal definitions we'll use and that are used in science. So a sensation is a response of the sensory system when it detects a stimulus. It's what you feel in your tongue when you taste a new flavor, for example. Perception has to do with the mental processing of that information. So think of sensation as that biological pickup that something has happened, and perception helps you interpret what it means. One of the most important sensory systems in early development is the auditory system, because the more sounds that a developing infant hears, the better they can develop a functional language system. Language understanding usually develops in the left hemisphere. If you look here on this picture, it's the brownish region of the map of the brain, and another part of the brain usually processes expressive language or speech, and that's that red zone. So while they are close to each other in the speech center, you'll notice that the hearing actually occurs in the green area, so it's adjacent to where we make sense of the sensation. So first you have to bring in the information, that's sensation, then you have to interpret it. That's perception. And language communication, such as comprehension and expression, are both influenced by the ability to interpret the sensations. So perception happens after sensation. And infants' brains are particularly attuned to their own social and perceptual experiences. So the more an infant hears a certain sound, the more their brain is ready to hear that sound. So that is why infants' brains tend to get very specific to the sound system that's going on around them. So way before an infant is going to produce words, the architecture for understanding the language is being created by your sensory and perceptive system. And there are parts of your cortex which are thought to be completely dedicated to integrating information from the senses and making sense out of it. So early on, hearing is one of the last senses that develops fully. It occurs during the last trimester of pregnancy. I'm sorry, I misspoke. Let me back up on that. I would stop the tape and edit, but I keep making mistakes. So hearing develops during the last trimester of pregnancy, but it's actually the most advanced of the newborn's senses. So hearing is the most advanced of the newborn's senses, and we can actually perceive speech by 4 months of age. Now that's different than seeing, which is actually the least mature sense at birth. right away, newborns can focus maybe at about 4 to 30 inches away, but they have a hard time changing their focus of their eyes. Experience and the growth of the visual cortex helps them to recognize shapes, helps them to scan the environment for information, and helps them pick up details. But they usually cannot learn how to take information from two eyes in order to understand depth until they're about 3 months of age. Now, smell and taste are usually better developed than vision at birth. They are thought to be present because they're so important for survival. The idea that a bad smell or a bad taste signals something toxic to the person is thought to be why they emerge evolutionarily earlier on. Smell and taste are rapidly influenced by your experiences and your family's culture. So, for example, foods that a family might eat, foods that one family eats but another family doesn't, are going to impact the things that an infant tends to prefer. Now, touch and pressure, which we also refer to as pain, are also usually pretty well developed early on as soon as we're born. And most infants prefer to be securely held, and light touch may be a little bit disorganizing, but firm touch is usually preferred. And that's why swaddling or putting the infant in tight blankets or putting them in a sleeper where it somewhat contains their movement. The thought there is that you can soothe an infant by putting just the right amount of limit on their movement so that their world becomes a bit more predictable and they're able to anticipate and predict what they're about to feel. That allows them to fall asleep. Pain and temperature sensation are strongly connected to our ability to perceive touch. And pain perception in infants is not very well understood. There's some research that suggests that we don't truly experience pain until later in the first year of life or the second year. Some scientists have presented data that suggests that infants do perceive pain, particularly pain in the form of hunger, as early as the first few weeks of life. But in general, we usually treat newborn infants, particularly premature infants, as being able to perceive pain, and we do what we can to reduce that perception. So while your sensory and your perceptive systems are developing and integrating, we also have a lot of exploratory behavior that leads to the development of motor skills, primarily gross and fine motor skills. So let's talk about each of these. Motor skills are those learned abilities to move a part of your body, and it has to do with every single action that you take, from taking a step to moving your fingers around to learning how to walk. Gross motor skills involve large body movements such as walking, jumping, running, crawling. And it's very important to keep in mind this concept of cephalocaudal growth as well as proximodistal growth. These two ways of developing motor skills, these two underlying principles of motor skill development, are really important for you guys to know. So let's chat about them. Cephalocaudal growth means that human beings tend to put most of their resources into growth from the head down to the body. So our heads develop first, they get most of the metabolic energy, and as we've discussed, most infants have an overly large head relative to the rest of their body. As that growth then moves down from the head, down to the trunk, down to the arms and legs, we see the rest of the body kind of catching up with the head. So cephalocaudal development means that we tend to grow from the head down. Proximodistal development is another important principle, which suggests that we put more resources in the middle of our bodies, and then over time, those resources are diverted out to the edges. So there is more neurological and metabolic resources given to developing the trunk and your heart and your breathing and your ability to support your breathing. After that's been accomplished, then the child begins to get more resources put to their outer limbs, like their arms and then their hands and their legs and then their feet. So early in infancy, we're working on growth of the core, and then as the baby gets older, you get better skills in arms and legs. That's proximodistal development, from the center out. Across the course in development, then, you'll see that a baby will learn how to hold her head up independently, then learn to sit, then learn to bring oneself into a standing position. Then usually there's crawling, a couple different kinds of crawling, like you might get the commando crawl, where they're on their elbows and their knees, and then they are launched up and they're on their hands and their knees. You get walking, then you get walking backwards, you get running in a clumsy way, and over time, learning how to jump. By about 8 months, we usually have pretty good accomplishment of crawling. The alternating in an effective way takes a little time and takes a lot of practice, but once a baby has learned how to manage her arms and legs in a crawling fashion, then the baby usually has enough strength to be able to pull herself to stand and to walk. So as the baby is doing all these movements all the time, sometimes in discoordinated ways, sometimes in coordinated ways, we begin to see the development increasingly of strength of the muscles, coordination of the muscles, brain maturation, and lots and lots and lots of practice opportunities will help strengthen and mature these systems. This is part of why tummy time has become important in infant development. So you want babies to have opportunities to be on their stomach and practicing holding their heads up and looking out and being able to use their arms and legs with practice. Fine motor skills have to do with those smaller body movements, like the movements of your hands and fingers, to do something like to sew something or to pick up something small like a coin. Fine motor skills are also shaped by your practice, by how often you practice, so we would call that an opportunity sort of practice, but they're shaped too by your culture. Depending on the cultural values for how a child plays with toys or what a child does with his or her hands, you're going to get slightly different fine motor development trajectories across different cultures. So whereas all healthy infants develop motor skills in the same general sequence, in other words, in the same general order, the age that they master or acquire these skills does vary. And those variations as to when an infant does these motor skills are the result of all kinds of things, including their genetic makeup, what happens in their culture, the way their caregivers are responding to them, their opportunities in their environment, even their nutrition. So we have learned across cultures that sensory and motor development are thought to happen in the same order, but sometimes the milestones are going to happen at different times based on the priorities and experiences within different cultures. This is why it's very important, whenever we think about child development, to recognize that there's no one right way to develop, and a difference in development is not a deficit. Doesn't mean there's something wrong. Slower development relative to the norms around you could indicate a problem, though, that needs attention. So, for example, in Bali, which is a part of Indonesia, it's an important part of native culture for an infant to not have his feet hit the ground until around the first year of life. So for the first 12 months or so, a baby in Bali is usually held very closely by a caring adult, either a parent or an extended family member usually. Infants in Bali, therefore, are getting more experience and practice in their sensory system and body-to-body contact. They're having a lot of face-to-face social contact, and it's thought from some studies that children in Bali develop very strong relationships with their parents and can be even advanced in social concepts such as empathy or emotional expressiveness or responsiveness. So the social bonding that happens in those 12 months might be accelerated by this unique caregiver experience related to a belief that an infant's feet should not touch the ground. Now, it's thought that this belief emerged from a theology as well as a practical purpose. There are evidently a lot of snakes and other dangerous things in the ground and on the ground in Bali, so the practice of keeping an infant close to a caregiver off the ground could have had safety reasons for emerging. Now, while their social and emotional development might actually be enhanced by this practice, it turns out their motor skills are often slowed. Because an infant in Bali is held tightly all the time, they are not exploring their environment with a lot of physical movements as much as infants who grow up in other places. So they are often delayed relative to Western infants when it comes to the milestones of learning how to sit and learning how to crawl and learning how to walk. But they do usually accomplish those milestones. It's just that in their culture, it's done a little bit later than it would be in other cultures. So that's an example of a time where a difference doesn't mean a deficit. So it's not like Balinese infants don't learn to crawl or walk. They do it on a different timeline. And it's also important to look at when a culture has a practice that might impact one aspect of development, odds are that same practice could be having a different impact on a different domain. So for the Balinese infants, their social and emotional functioning might be enhanced by this practice, even as their motor development takes a little bit more time. So, fascinating area. I hope that I've hit the key points for you in this particular module. And I think when you get to the assignment that looks at the motor development milestones, you'll also see a really interesting film that helps to show you what it looks like across the first 2 years of life. Thanks for your attention.